Thank you for being with us today in person or online. We are live streaming this event, so please make sure your mobile phones are switched off or in silent mode. My name is Ilgin Yorulmaz. I'm a freelance reporter and also serve as the second vice president of FCCJ. All 178 penal institutions in Japan are national facilities under the jurisdiction of the Correction Bureau of the Ministry of Justice. 11 of those are designated as women's prisons. Japan's justice system relies more on imprisonment and less or not at all on alternatives such as community service. After the appeal process is exhausted, prisoners in Japan are transferred from the detention prison to the prison where they will serve their sentence, such as Fuchu Prison in Tokyo for men and Tochigi Prison in Tochigi Prefecture for women. As of 2021, there are nearly 4,000 imprisoned women in Japan, maybe down from a high of 5,000, nearly 5,000 in 2011. Today, we will focus on those women prisoners and their rights. Our guests today argue that women convicted of criminal offenses are harshly penalized and suffer violations of their human rights during imprisonment. In a report titled, "They Don't Treat Us Like Human Beings," which will be released for the first time today here at FCCJ, Human Rights Watch examines abuses behind the women's prison walls and makes recommendations. Based on interviews with 58 former prisoners and a person who was in prison at the time of the research, contributions from 11 lawyers and penal reform experts, as well as media reports and government documents, this report lists abuses such as the use of restraints on pregnant prisoners, inadequate access to medical services, including mental health services, the arbitrary and prolonged use of solitary confinement, and verbal abuse by prison guards, among others. Our guests today are from my immediate right here, Teppei Kasai. He is the Asia Program Officer, Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. Ayuko Takatoh, she's an attorney at law, and Goro Koto. He's the director of Japan Advocacy Network for Drug Policy. So they will share with us the findings of this report, and then we will open it for comments and question and answers. Please.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Teppei Kasai, Program Officer at Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much for attending our press conference today. From 2018 to early 2023, Human Rights Watch conducted research into the human rights situation of women's prisons in Japan. This research was originally inspired by a previous research project conducted by my colleagues into abuses against institutionalized children, who many of their parents were either imprisoned or formerly imprisoned. Our initial plan for this research was to interview currently imprisoned women. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Justice did not grant us access. We changed our approach by interviewing nearly 70 people consisting of formerly imprisoned women, including a woman who was imprisoned at the time of research, as well as lawyers and penal reform experts. The following is a summary of our main findings as well as our recommendations. Once imprisoned, many women face abuses behind prison walls, which are often caused or compounded by the prison's lack of resources in addressing their needs and rights. For instance, under the Act on Penal Detention Facilities and Treatment of Inmates and Detainees, imprisoned women can legally request to be with their babies under a year old inside the prison, which can be extended for 6 months with the permission of the prison ward. However, Ministry of Justice figures show that between 2011 and 2017, only 3 out of 184 imprisoned women who gave birth during imprisonment were allowed to be with their babies behind prison walls. Formerly imprisoned women said that most are separated from their babies at birth without a detailed explanation that they are legally allowed to request to be with their babies in prison. Separation at birth can be traumatizing and harm the health of both the mother and infant and can interfere with breastfeeding and parent-child bonding. In addition, the number of imprisoned older women has increased significantly over recent decades. Research by Human Rights Watch And studies by the Ministry of Justice found that as Japan's society ages, some older women repeatedly commit non-violent crimes such as shoplifting because of social isolation and loneliness. Formerly imprisoned women highlighted the particular care and support needs of imprisoned older women, including re-entering their communities, many of which Japan's prisons do not meet. Violations related to drugs are the second leading cause of imprisonment of women in Japan after theft. Women who are imprisoned for simple possession or use of drugs are often imprisoned more than once, suggesting they suffer from substance use disorders. Studies also suggest many of these women suffer from trauma caused by childhood abuse and domestic violence. While women's prisons offer rehabilitation programs for substance use disorders, formerly imprisoned women and experts said the programs are generally ineffective at reducing recidivism among women offenders. In addition, imprisonment for minor drug offenses can fuel recidivism as it adds to the pre-existing trauma. Other forms of abuse within women's prisons in Japan include the use of restraints on imprisoned pregnant women, mistreatment of imprisoned transgender people, arbitrary and prolonged use of solitary confinement, verbal abuse by prison guards, inadequate access to health and mental health services, overly stringent restrictions on communications with the outside world, and a lack of effective oversight of prison conditions by an independent body. While prison conditions should be improved, systemic issues should also be addressed. Japan's justice system has few alternatives to imprisonment and overly depends on imprisonment. People found guilty of criminal offenses in Japan are rarely considered for alternatives to imprisonment other than monetary fines and the whole or partial suspension of prison sentences with or without probation, and suffer violations of their human rights during imprisonment. Mothers of young children are particularly affected by having to spend time in the prison. Japan's current legal framework, notably Article 482 of the Criminal Procedure Code, allows prosecutors to suspend prison sentences for various reasons, including the defendant's age, health, and family situation. But prosecutors rarely invoke this law. Ministry of Justice figures speak to this reality. Only 11 imprisoned women have their sentences suspended over the last 5 years. Imprisonment should be the last resort. Human Rights Watch recommends that the Japanese government urgently adopt and implement measures to reduce the number of imprisoned women, particularly by introducing alternative sentencing methods outlined in the Tokyo Rules, including community service. At the same time, the Ministry of Justice should end imprisonment for the simple possession or use of drugs through decriminalization and work with the Ministry of Health to provide voluntary relapse prevention programs for substance use disorder outside of penal institutions. For those who are imprisoned, the Ministry of Justice should ensure all penal institutions abide by international best practices spelled out in international standards such as the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, or the Nelson Mandela Rules and the Bangkok Rules. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kasai-san. Takatoh-san, may we hear from you, please?
Good afternoon. I'm Ayuko Takatoh, a lawyer and board member of the Center for Prisoners' Rights Japan, a non-profit organization which supports prisoners and advocates for the abolition of the death penalty in Japan. I have made it my life's work to support prisoners, including consulting them on their treatment within penal institutions, and in some cases filing lawsuits against the Japanese government regarding problems of the situation in such institutions. HRW has just released a report on women prisoners in Japan. The fact that an international human rights organization such as HRW has taken up this issue is something greatly encouraging. Unfortunately, the human rights situation in prisoners in Japan cannot be said to be good. Last November, United Nations Committee on Civil Liberties issued its summary findings, including an even greater number of recommendations regarding problems in Japan's prisons than ever before. Concerns were raised about solitary confinement for long periods of time, in some cases even for decades, the lack of sufficient and get access to medical service within penal institutions, and insufficient access to lawyers and family members for prisoners. Recommendations were also issued for Japan to review laws denying prisoners the rights to vote in elections, and to take necessary measures to assure just treatment of LGBT individuals in penal institutions. HRW has taken the unique initiative to investigate and report specifically about the situation of women prisoners. There are many problems which can be seen for their particular perspective, including issues unique to such female prisoners such as childbirth and childcare, as well as relating to crime particularly common among women, such as drug-related crimes. Interaction with family members is of great importance for the social reintegration and rehabilitation of prisoners. Particularly for women, it is not uncommon to gain a new meaning of life through giving birth and raising children. From this perspective, meetings with family members are given importance in European prisons. Meeting rooms are not bare and sterile facilities, but at times are instead colorful rooms in which children can enjoy their time with toys and also provided. In some countries, meeting rooms are even equipped with a bed so that prisoners can maintain a relationship with their partners. On the other hand, in Japanese prisons, while there is a legal provision which allows the raising young children within penal institutions, there are rarely any actual such cases in practice. While prisoners in Japan are basically allowed visit from family members, staff of the prison facility are always present, and they can only meet from opposite side of an acrylic screen. Prisoners are not able to hug or even touch their own children. The number of visits is also limited, and the duration is restricted to around 30 minutes. Medical care within prison facilities is another major problem. Legally, the same standard of medical care must be provided within penal institutions as in the broader society. However, the reality is quite different. In Japan, medical care within such facilities is under the jurisdiction not of Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, but of the Ministry of Justice. For this reason, there are a lack of budgets for medical care within prisons, and a shortage of doctors, equipment, and medicines means that medical services are at that great. There are many further problems which cannot all be touched on today. Improving the situation within Japan's prison is not an easy task. This is because many people in Japan believe that prison is a place where people should suffer. This way of thinking comes from the fact that many Japanese people believe that people who commit crime are fundamentally different to themselves, and that they should be excluded from society. In other words, this idea may come from the fact that since Japan is a very safe country, crime is not something which is close to everyday life of many people. While it is good that Japan is a safe country, people who commit crime are not a particular kind of person, completely different to the general public. Anyone has a possibility of making a mistake. In Japan, where crime is not so common, we need to particularly deliberate when addressing how we as a society should accept people who have committed crimes. I hope that HRW's new report will be read by many people, leading to the broader understanding of current situation in Japan, and in turn an improvement of the conditions within Japan's prisons. Thank you.
Thank you, Takatoh sensei. And Koto-san, could you please do your statement? Thank you.
こんにちは、ことゴロと申します。今日お集まりいただきましてありがとうございます。 Hello, my name is Koto Goro. Thank you everybody for being here today.
私は日本薬物政策アドボカシーネットワーク、通称 NIAN の事務局長です。
I am the director of the Japan Advocacy Network for Drug Policy, otherwise known as NIAN.
NIAN は薬物を使うことがある人の立場に立って権利擁護を行います。その一つとして、この国の薬物対策が人間の尊厳と権利、そして健康と福祉を大切にするものになってほしいと声を上げる活動をしています。
NIAN advocates for the protection of rights from the position of people who use drugs. As one such activity, we raise our voice in regards to Japan's drug-related policy, particularly calling for it to value human dignity, rights, as well as health and welfare.
ただとても小さな団体で、現在の主な活動はハームリダクション東京という関係団体の広報活動です。
We are a very small organization, however, and our main activity at the moment is awareness-raising activities for a related organization called Harm Reduction Tokyo.
ハームリダクション東京は私が共同代表として2021年に設立した団体で、主な活動は週に4回チャットサービスを開いています。
I am the co-chairperson of Harm Reduction Tokyo, which was established in 2021. Our main activity at the moment is to hold chat consultation services 4 times weekly.
そこでは薬物を使うことがある人たちが困っていることなど安心して話せる SNS 空間のシェルターになっています。年間2000回以上薬物を使用することがある人たちとチャットしています。
This service is an online shelter within social media where people who use drugs can speak in a safe and comfortable way about the different challenges that they are facing. Each year we have more than 2,000 chats with people who use drugs.
チャットで出会う人たちの中には若い人たち、そして女性たちが本当にたくさんいます。
So within the people we encounter in these chats, there is a very large number of young people and also many women.
活動を通して私たちが思うこと、望むことは、薬物使用がある人を犯罪者にすることは人権を侵害していて有害なものになっているので、犯罪者とするのではなく、地域で親切な支援を充実させることに政府が方針転換をすることです。
What I feel and also hope through this work is that the government will, instead of treating people who use drugs as criminals, which itself violates human rights and then becomes harmful itself, rather than that the government will change its policy to enhance a kind of support that can be done within the community.
これは個人の薬物の使用やそのための所持や取引などマイナーな行為については刑務所に入れないということだけではなくて、そもそも犯罪にする必要がないということです。そしてそれは女性だけじゃなく全ての人に対して同じです。
So this not only means that individuals should not be sent to prison for minor acts of use, such as possession or selling of drugs, but that this should not even be a crime in the first place, and that this should apply not only to women but to all people.
女性の薬物事犯の受刑者にどのような人権侵害が起きているか例を挙げます。
So I will next share some examples of human rights violations against women who are imprisoned for drug-related violations.
警察に逮捕されると拘留されたり、また実刑を受けたりすることもあります。そして刑務所の中や地域の中で保護観察所による薬物再乱用防止のプログラムなどを受けることが強制されます。
Once arrested by the police, a person is detained and at times then sentenced to prison time. From there, they are forced to undergo substance abuse prevention programs, either within the prison or in the community, such as those which are provided by the probation office.
その現状がこの報告書でもこう指摘されています。
But the actual situation of these programs and the issues therein are referenced as follows in the report announced today.
物質使用症のある女性受刑者には家族間暴力を含む心的外傷の過去が多く見られる。40% 以上が自傷行為を、約 46% が深刻な自殺燃料、また約 73% がパートナーからの DV 被害を経験していた。
So many women prisoners who experience or who have substance use disorder have experienced domestic violence in the past. 40% of such women who use drugs cut themselves. 46% had had serious suicidal thoughts. And 73% had been victims of domestic violence from their partners.
刑務所では物質使用症の治療が行われているものの同意に基づいておらず、過去の心的外傷、特に DV や性虐待といったジェンダーを理由とする心的外傷に十分に対処できていない。
While substance use disorder treatment is provided in prisons, this is not consent-based, and it does also not adequately address past traumas, particularly gender-based traumas such as domestic violence and sexual abuse.
薬物単純処置に厳罰が課され、メンタルヘルスサービスに十分にアクセスできない。
Severe penalties are imposed for simple drug possession, and access to mental health services is inadequate.
もし女性たちが捕まることなく地域社会で薬物依存症の支援を受けようとすればどうなるでしょうか。
So what would happen if these women sought help for substance use disorder within the community instead of being arrested?
まず支援を受けるタイミングを自分で決めることができます。どのような支援を受けるか、その時の生活状況などに応じて選ぶことができます。
First, they would be able to decide themselves when they want to receive support and what kind of support that would be based on their living situation at the time.
そしてそこでは司法じゃなくジェンダーの視点に基づいた支援のための専門家たちと出会い、その人に合った無理ない支援やプログラムを見立てていくことが可能になります。
And from there, it would be possible to meet professionals for support based not on a judicial perspective, but on a gender perspective, and to be able to identify support and programs that could be more suited for the person, more possible for them to follow through.
例えば子育てしている、心的外傷があるかもしれない、今メンタルヘルスの調子が悪い、他の疾患もある、そして薬物の使用も何とかしたいというとき、地域の親切な支援につながれば、どの困りごとや大変さに焦点を当てて、どういう内容のアプローチをするのがいいのか、その人に応じて見立てることができます。
For example, if there is a person who is raising a child, may have trauma, their mental health condition may not be very good, or they may have other diseases at the same time, but also wants to manage their drug use. If they can be connected to a kind support, then they can identify which problems and difficulties to focus on and what kind of content or approach is most suitable for that person considering their circumstances.
本来はこうした丁寧で親切な支援を受けられる方が本人にとっても社会にとっても有益と思います。もちろんそこでは何も強制されることはありません。
So having this kind of both careful and kind support available is likely to be more beneficial both for the individual and for society itself. And of course, in this kind of case, nothing is being forcibly imposed.
もう一つは国連は薬物使用がある人のうち物質使用症がある人は 13% と直近の報告で発表しています。
One further point is that in its most recent report, the United Nations announced that of people who use drugs, 13% have a substance use disorder.
つまり、ある人が薬物を使用しているけれど依存していないし、暮らしている上で特に困りごとがないということがあります。その場合は治療や回復支援は必要ありません。
So this means that there are people who are users of drugs but are not dependent or addicted and do not have problems related within their daily lives. In such cases, there would be no need for treatment or recovery support.
そういう人が逮捕され、拘留されたり、受刑したりすると、そのことで暮らしにくくなって困りごとが発生します。
But when people such as these are arrested, detained, or imprisoned, it is then that they start to experience difficulties for their living, which gives birth to further problems.
薬物使用で困っているのではなくて、厳しい薬物対策のせいで窮地に落ちて暮らしにくくなり、孤立化して社会に戻されるのです。そのため、逮捕されなければ必要のなかった支援が社会に出てから必要になります。
So such people are not in trouble because of their use of drugs, but rather because of the stringent drug policies that leave them in this state of, or very difficult or a state of distress, which makes their lives more difficult and isolates them before they are then returned to society. At this time, therefore, they need social support that would not have been necessary had they not been arrested.
薬物事犯で逮捕され受刑した人たちが出所後に暮らしが良くなったとしたら、それは社会の中でその人にとって親切な支援に出会ったからです。
So if people who have been arrested and imprisoned for drug-related offenses have a better life after they are released, or the situation is better, this is because they were able to receive kind support within society.
それなら逮捕することなく、その支援に出会えるようにすることができるはずです。
But if that is the case, then they should be able to receive this kind of support without having to be arrested first.
薬物使用が健康に害を与えることがあります。
Drug use can be harmful to health.
ただ、健康の観点で考えるから、犯罪にして当事者たちを追い詰めて生きづらくさせるのではなく、 犯罪にしないで支援につなげる、その方が個人にとっても社会全体としても有益なので、非犯罪化にして地域の親切な支援をもっと豊かにするように方針転換していく国が増えています。
However, from a very perspective focused on health, we see that more and more countries are changing their policies to decriminalize drug use and instead to enhance this kind or more adequate support within the community, rather than criminalizing and making life more difficult for the people concerned. This is seen as more beneficial not only for the individual but also for society on the whole.
日本もそこを目指して進んでいくことが必要だと考えます。
I believe it's also necessary for Japan to move and progress towards this same goal.
以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koto-san, and thank you, Mary Joyce, for your wonderful translation. So, if I may just recap some of the findings of this report. I hope you have a copy of the report, by the way. If you don't, please ask for a copy before you leave. The report is called "They Don't Treat Us Like Human Beings." And it's striking because as of 2021, which is the last date we have data from, about 4,000 women prisoners are in 11 correctional facilities. 48% of these women are convicted of theft, and most of them are actually petty theft. And 33% of offenses are involving drugs, as Koto-san explained. There's no distinction, though, among women prisoners in these 11 correctional facilities. They're all lumped together, not based on their convictions or crimes. I hear that they stay usually 1, 2, or 3 years. First-time offenders, usually the sentence is suspended, but if you're a repeat offender, then you are imprisoned. And 20% of women inmates are actually 65 years and older. And that's like a 4-fold increase from 2003. So many elderly inmates. And of course we know, as we listened, majority of them feel isolated and they're basically committing petty theft crimes so that they can be in prison. So that's another unique characteristic of Japanese women inmates. Also, 25% of those, 1 in 4 women admitted to prison in 2021 had one or more of the so-called mental health conditions, and these are intellectual disability, personality disorder, neurotic disorder, or other mental disorder. And finally, as our speakers mentioned, 73% of these women had been a victim of domestic and or sexual violence. This is actually from another survey, which is included in that report. And finally, sadly, 48% in 2021 had prior convictions, which means they are repeat offenders, and 85% of those were unemployed at the time of the arrest. So these are too many statistics, but I just wanted to recap because they are striking. If I may just kickstart the conversation by asking, well, one hopes that these women did not end up in prison in the first place. So incarceration and recidivism, that is, repeat offenses. These are rather complex problems, but they sound like they are the symptoms of a bigger issue in society, in any society. So if I may ask maybe all three of you, starting with Kasai-san, what is the big issue here? Is it the loneliness, lack of communication, treating mental health like a taboo subject, unemployment, homelessness, all of them? Please.
Thank you. Yeah, just to clarify, the figures that you mentioned earlier, they're about women entering prison in 2021. So of the people who entered prison in 2021, 20-something, whatever, or older people and so on. And to answer your question, I think we touched upon the subjects in the report. Obviously, it's not just our research, but the Ministry of Justice research shows that older women tend to express a sense of isolation, social isolation. Many of them are obviously unemployed. They feel that they are financially unstable. I mean, there are other underlying issues, the statistics show that many of the women entering prison in 2021 were diagnosed as having some sort of mental health disorder or issue. Those all obviously intersect and contribute to these women, for example, committing petty theft or using drugs. But that is not to say that all women or most women in prison for theft or drugs have a certain disorder or so on, like Koto-san said. I think we have to be careful and not to stereotype these women, but it's also at the same time important to recognize that there are these economic and social and psychosocial issues at play. So, yeah.
Can I answer in Japanese?
どうぞ。Please.
理由は本当に様々で、個々人によってだいぶ違っていると思います。
So the reasons are very much varied and depends a lot according to the individual.
私が接している女性受刑者、元受刑者の中には、貧困の問題、家庭の問題、あとは知的の問題、精神の問題を抱えている方が多くいらっしゃいますが、ただ必ずしも貧困なだけではないですし、必ずしも家族がいないというわけでもないです。
So within the women prisoners, both former and current that I am in contact with, there are many who have reasons related to poverty, family-related issues, also intellectual, psychological related issues as well. However, that's not to say that this is the case for all women. Poverty is not always an issue at hand, and also it is not always that they, lack a family and so on.
中には経済的にはあまり困っていない、サポートしてくれる家族がいる、それでも、犯罪を犯してしまうという人はいらっしゃいます。
Within there are women who are not experiencing financial difficulties and do have support of their family, but do still commit violations.
だからこそ確一的な、刑務所への収容ですとか、確一的な、同じプログラムを受けさせる、強制するっていうことは適切ではなく、その個々人に合ったサポートをすべきだと考えております。
And it is for this very reason that I believe that rather than just having automatic imprisonment or having that as the only kind of penalty to be imposed, the same program to be enforced no matter what the circumstances are, rather than this, there should be different kind of support or different alternatives available that can be done according to the individual.
笠井さんがすごく上手に答えてくださってたので、私は特に付け加えることはありません。
Mr. Kasai responded very well, so I don't have anything particularly to add.
Does anybody have any comments or questions as of now? Please. 1, 2, 3. Yes. Please. どうぞ。はい。Please identify yourself in Japanese or English.
東京支部の望月と申します。すいません。英語がちょっとわからないのが多くてですね、もしかして答えていることを聞いてしまうかもしれないんですけど、ちょっと直前にいただいた資料で、その子供を産んで育てられる権利を持っているのにそれができないという書かれ方をしてたんですけど、それちょっと具体的にどういうことなのか。海外ではそういう産んだ受刑者が産んでも赤ちゃんを見れる権利があるのに、それができないということだとすると、そういったことができるってことが広くやっぱり社会でメディアを通じて認知されてないことも影響しているのかなと思うんですが、その点をちょっとすいません、お答えいただいているかもしれないんですけど、もう一度分かる方には教えていただきたいんですが。
My name is Mochizuki of the Tokyo Shimbun. I apologize if this has already been covered and perhaps my English didn't catch it, but I would like to ask, within the materials that were shared, there was mention of the right for women after childbirth to be together with their children in penal facilities, and that, however, while this right is there, it is not necessarily being implemented or being put into place. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more concretely about the situation of that in Japan, and also examples of overseas in prisons in other countries as well. For example, if women prisoners do have the right to be together with their children, is it an issue that perhaps it is not broadly known that that right actually exists here in Japan through the media and so on? If you could elaborate on this, that would be appreciated.
I should answer in English, right?
Whichever you prefer.
日本語でいいですか？はい。刑事収容法でしたっけ？刑事収容法っていう法律の下だと、刑事所長の 許可があれば1年刑務所内で子供を養育できます。
So within the criminal procedures law, there is a ruling that's or a clause that says that if there is approval of the judge at hand, then the women prisoners have the right to have their children together with them in the prison for 1 year after childbirth.
で1年経ってさらに半年延長したいって要請すればまた刑事所長の、刑務所長すみません刑務所長の許可があれば延長できます。なので合計1年6ヶ月刑務所内で子供を養育できますよっていう法律はすでにあります。
And so that is if the head of the prison facility gives their approval, then after 1 year a request can be made for an extension of this for a further 6 months. And so if that is also approved, then for a total of 1.5 years after birth, the child can be together with their mother in the penal facility.
この報告書の中にある通り、これ国会答弁で出た数字なんですけど、2011年から2017年の間、184人の女性が刑務所内で出産をし、刑務所内ではない、刑務所、外の病院で出産するんですけど、服役中に出産した。で、ただそのうち3人しか刑務所内で養育ができていない。で、すごく短いです。12日、10日、8日です。なので事実上全然法律が活用できていないです。その一つの理由としては刑務所側とかその法務省もそうですし政府側とかがその当事者に対してちゃんとこの法律に基づく権利の説明をしていない。なのですぐ出産したら、ちょっと赤ちゃんと一緒に入れるけど事実上すぐ引き離されて親族に渡されるか児童養護施設に送られるということです。
And so this is also mentioned in the report, but figures which are taken from questions within the diet as well show that in a given period there was 184 women who gave birth while they were in prison. They give birth not actually in the prison but at an external hospital. But within that, only 3 of the women actually were able to stay with their child after this time, and that was only for the short period of 12, 10, and 8 days. So we see that while the right is in place legally for them, this is not actually being implemented. There are various reasons for this, but this includes, for example, whether the government or the Ministry of Justice is not sufficiently informing or explaining these rights to the prisoners so they are not aware that this is the case. And then in practice, after they give birth, they may be able to be together with their baby for just a very short time, and then the baby is then taken away and given either to family members or to juvenile facilities for child raising from there.
そこに関連してなんですけど、すみません、重ねて。権利の説明ができてないということで、おそらくその3人の方がそれしか短期間しかやれなかったと思うんですけど、国会でもそれが質疑になったということは、その質問後はそういったことが行われないようになって改善できているのか、そうじゃないのか、説明できていないこと自体が何らかのその説明責任の義務を果たしてないと思うんですが、その法律上はその刑務所内での処遇の規則なんかには違反することにならないのか、分かる範囲内でいいんですが、教えていただけますか。
And so to add on to that, further to say the figures before were between 2011 and 2017. And the follow-up question was that given the fact that this was raised within the questions in the diet, if there has been any improvement in the situation from then, if there has been any further information, explanation given to the women prisoners, for example, and it is the fact that this is not being fulfilled. The fact that these 3 women, even though they were able to be with their children, it was only for a very short of time, means that they were also probably not fully informed as well. So if could extrapolate a little bit more on that.
この件に関しては権利っていう表現を使ったんですけど、その刑務所長の許可がないと養育ができないので、例えばじゃあ刑務所長がダメって言ったら、その権利が行使できないので、そういう状況を、別にその処遇に対する違反というかそういうことではないですね。ただ刑事所長の許可がないとダメっていう前提です。ただそもそも刑事所長の判断とかっていう前に私が聞き取りした数十名の女性受刑者、受刑してた元受刑者の方たちの中でもちろん幼い子供がいた時に、受刑した人の中にはいました。でその人たちにこの法律について知っていますか、あるいはその弁護士とか、裁判とか、検察の方から説明はありましたかって聞くと、ほぼほぼなかったですね。噂では聞いたことあるし、刑務所の中で赤ちゃんの なんていうの、赤ちゃん用品っていうのを売ってるのを見たことあるけど、実際に赤ちゃんの声を聞いたりとか見たことはないっていうふうに言っています。
And so while we use the word that this is a right to be together with the children, to be precise, it is only if there is the permission given by the head of the prison. So if the head of the prison does not give permission, then that is not a right that the women automatically have access to. For that reason, then, if they're not allowed to be with their children, that is not a violation of the rules in regards to their treatment in prison and so on within the current situation in Japan. In regards to this as well, within the conversations or the interviews had together with the formerly imprisoned women as part of this survey within several dozen women, there were several who did have young children at the time of being imprisoned, and when asked if they were aware of this law or knew of their rights for access and so on in this way, whether their lawyers or the court prosecutors and so on had mentioned this, most of the women were not aware at all. Some said that they had heard some kind of rumors about this but were not familiar with the details. Some said that they saw, for example, the shop within the prison selling baby goods and so expected there was something but had never seen or heard a baby within the facilities, for example.
少し高藤から補足をさせていただきます。おおむね笠井さんがお話しくださった通りなんですけれども、今ちょっと出た法律というのが刑事収容施設および被収容者等の処遇に関する法律というちょっと長い名前の法律の66条に規定されています。
And one point just to add on to what Mr. Kasai has already said, these details are outlined in Article 66 on the Act on Penal Detention Facilities and Treatment of Inmates and Detainees of Japan.
この66条の1項では、刑事施設の長は女子の被収容者がその子を刑事施設内で養育したい旨の申し出をした場合において、相当と認めるときは、その子が1歳に達するまでこれを許すことができると規定されています。
And so within this Article 66, the first clause says that if a request is made and the permission is given by the head of the prison, then an infant can be together or raised by their mother within the prison facilities for up to 1 year.
刑事施設の中の運用というのはなかなか私たちが外から知ることはできないんですけれども、笠井さんのインタビューから分かることは、おそらくここに書かれている養育したい旨の申し出自体がない。だからこそ、刑事施設の長はわざわざ許可をすることはないというところにあるのだと思います。
And so while it's difficult for us to know from the outside how this is actually operationalized within the prisons, hearing from the contents of Mr. Kasai's interviews, we can assume that it is because there is no request or application made by this woman that they are not given the permission for being together with their children.
例えば逮捕拘留された場合においては、弁護人が選任できることは、法律上告知しなければならないというふうに規定されています。こういう場合はもう法律上、告知義務がありますので、当然に、警察等は捕まった人に対してですね、あなたにはこういう権利がありますよ、弁護人選任できる権利がありますよということを告知しなければなりません。
And so, for example, in regards to the rights for people to have access to a lawyer, this is something which at the time of their arrest it is mandatory for the police to say that you have the right to have a lawyer appointed to you, for example.
ただこう養育したい旨の申し出ということに関しては告知義務の規定がありませんので、告知をしなかったからといって直ちに法律違反になるということにはなっていません。
However, it is not mandatory to inform people of this right to be able to make a request to be with their children after childbirth. So therefore, even if they are not informing the prisoners of their right to this access or their right to make that question, then it is not something which is an infringement.
ただそれでいいかどうかというのは、十分検討しなければならない問題だと思います。
However, of course, whether this situation itself is as it should be, this is something which I think we need to have a lot more consideration about.
あと最後にで海外の実情なんですけれども、ちょっとどこの国かは私も今はっきり思い出せないんですが、おそらくヨーロッパの国だったと思いますけれども、刑事施設の中で、その赤ちゃんではない元学校に通うような子どもたちを養育し、子どもたちはそこ刑務所内から学校に通えるという国もあります。
And just to say briefly about the comparison to the situation in other countries, I can't remember exactly which country it was, but one country in Europe, there is also a case where not only for infants, but even school-aged children are able to remain together with their mothers and then actually commute to school from within the prison.
この場合、子どもたちへの影響を配慮して、住むところは当然 いわゆる日本の言う無機質な刑務所ではなく、温かみのある家庭的な施設になっていますし、子どもたちは刑事施設から通っているということが学校に知られないような配慮がされていると聞いております。
However, as to, of course, questions about the impact that this has on the children, we've heard that the housing in which they are living in these kind of cases is not the usual kind of sterile prison facilities that we would imagine, but rather a more home-like facility in which they are living, and also measures are taken in consideration for the children to ensure that it is not known at the school or within the community that they are commuting from within the prison.
Thank you. Please, yes. And if you can keep the questions and answers short, I would very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the really interesting talk. I'm Alice French from Nikkei Asia. I have two hopefully short questions. The first one is for all three of you. And I think Japan around the world is notorious for having a low crime rate. And just sort of to play devil's advocate here, do you think that one reason behind the low crime rate is the fact that the conditions in prisons are particularly harsh and that imprisonment is kind of the only realistic option for punishment? My other question is for Koto-san. So recently I think we have seen slightly more sort of social discussion about potentially decriminalizing drugs or certain types of drugs in Japan, even with things like political parties popping up and talking about it. What do you think is the main barrier at the moment in Japanese society to decriminalizing drug use? Thanks.
似たような質問あります。日系アジアのアリス・フレンチと申します。まず最初の質問、3人への質問なんですけれども、日本は世界的にもやはり犯罪率が低い国として知られているんですけれども、もしかして、例えばですね、刑務所の中の状況が非常に厳しいということで、それがある意味で犯罪の防止、抑止になっているということも考えられるかもしれないんですけれども、それについてどのようにお考えなのかということ。そして2つのさんへの質問なんですけれども、最近日本の社会の中でもやはり薬物の非犯罪化などについての議論が少し活発になってきているような印象があります。政党などもそのような提言などもしているところもあるんですけれども、それがまだ日本の社会の中でそれができていない一番大きな障害障壁は何になるのでしょうか。
高藤から1つ目の質問について、実際皆さんが何で犯罪をしているのかっていうのが、逆にしないのかっていうのは明らかにはなってないので難しいところではありますけれども、死刑がその殺人の抑止力になっているかという研究があります。その研究の内容までちょっとここ見ては今日お話しする時間はありませんが、結局死刑制度があるからといって殺人の、犯罪率が高いということにもならないし、逆に死刑を廃止した国において死刑を廃止したから、殺人が増えたということもないというふうに言われております。
So to respond to the first question, of course we cannot know clearly why it is that people do or do not commit crime, so it's difficult to say definitively in regards to this. But as an example, I would like to take the issue of the death penalty and its connection to murder rates as well. Looking at the debate about whether having the death penalty in place is a prevention or deterrence in regards to murder. And there is a lot of research which exists in regards to this. There's perhaps not time to go into detail, but within the research there is no evidence that countries that do not have a death penalty have a higher murder rate, or that countries which abolish the death penalty then go on to have an increase in murders after that fact.
Anything to add? Okay. Sorry.
私から1つ目と2つ目の質問に答えたいです。
So I'd like to respond to both of the questions.
1つ目は、たとえ犯罪率が低いからといって、その犯罪者に対する人権侵害が正当化されることはないと考えています。
And so even if we look at the situation of having a low crime rate, whether that is something that can be connected to justifying any kinds of rights violations against people who do commit crimes is a question.
もし日本が犯罪率が低いということを誇りたいなら、受刑による人権侵害がなくて、それでもこの国は犯罪率が低いというふうにしたらいいと思うし、私はそういう国に住みたいです。
And so if Japan does want to be proud of the fact that it does have this low crime rate, it should be proud of both that and also the fact that it is not committing human rights violations against people who are convicted of committing crimes. And this is the kind of country in which I would want to live.
あと、非犯罪化が進まない理由の一つ、大きい理由の一つは、私はハームリダクションが政策に入っていないからだと考えています。
And as for the question in regards to decriminalization and why that is not progressing very much, I think the fact that harm reduction is not being included in policy is a major factor.
諸外国を見ても非犯罪化した国は、まずハームリダクションのサービスが地域で利用できるようになって、それから非犯罪化にシフトチェンジしていくことができると思っています。私も日頃のチャットで出会ってても、誰一人この人が捕まったら良くなるのにと思うことは全くありません。
And in regards to, if we compare to the situation in other countries which have decriminalized, for example, we see that first of all, having these kind of harm reduction measures in place within the community that can be accessed on the community level as well as a step that then allows the shift to decriminalization as the next progression from there as well. Within the people that I encounter in our chat services, our chat counseling services, there is not a single person within those conversations who I think, oh, I think this person should be arrested.
Can I ask for 5 more minutes of your time, please? Because this is a very interesting conversation and I want to give the space to everybody who wants to ask a question. Gentlemen, please, and then
西村フリーランス。Let me ask in Japanese. 日本語で質問します。お話聞いてて、私あまり詳しくなくて驚いたんですけれども、子供を産み育てるのに所長の許可がいるという法律の条文があるということなんですね。非常に違和感を感じるんですけれども、これ法律の問題と考えると、まずどの法律のどの条文を変えていく必要があるのかをお尋ねしたいのと、この法律を作るのは国会ですから、国会の議論ですね、どういう形で進んでて、法改正がこれどうか必要なのか、それとも現在ある法の運用で解決できる問題なのか、その辺の認識を伺いたいと思います。それからもしこうしたその女性の受刑者などに対する人権侵害があるんであれば、何か歴史的背景などがもしあるんであれば、あると認識であれば教えていただきたいと思います。
My name is Nishimura, a freelance reporter. I have 2 questions. First of all, perhaps because I'm not so familiar with this issue, I was quite surprised by some of the information, particularly about the fact that women need to have the permission of the head of the prison in order to be able to raise their infants together. So I would like to ask, looking at this, in order to change to correct this issue, I think that this is likely a legal issue. So what kind of law, what kind of legislation needs amendments in order to be able to change this situation? Also, to have, for example, to change law, then we need to have, of course, debate within the Diet. So how you would see progress in regards to this, if legislative change is needed, or if there can be an improvement made without an actual amendment of the law, but with a change in the way that it is being operationalized, for example. And the second question is if there are these kinds of human rights violations against women prisoners, if there is any particular historical background in relation to these.
はい、1問目のご質問ありがとうございます。そうですね、具体的には多分今その薬物の単純処置と使用っていういわゆる罪で服役している女性が多いっていうことで、そもそもその人たちが刑務所にいるべきなのか入れるべきなのかっていうところから始める必要があると思います。でそれをやらないと人はずっと刑務所に流れてしまう。で刑務所受刑中に、出産をするっていう、すごく非人間的な扱いを受けるっていう現実があるので、まず大体系東京ルールズっていうその国連の規則があるんですけど、そこに書かれている例えば社会奉仕活動、コミュニティサービスですよねとか他の、非拘禁措置っていうんですけど、そういったものをまず導入する。でそれは日本の刑事訴訟法ですよね。刑事訴訟法を、国会で変える、それが一つのステップかなと思います。
So first of all, if we take the issue of the simple possession and use of drugs, And looking at the number of women who are arrested and imprisoned for that, I think first of all we need to question about whether they should even be sent to prison for these kinds of violations, and that is the point from which we should start. Otherwise, rather than just sending them to prison in which they will then be in a situation of giving birth while they are imprisoned under this kind of inhumane treatment as well. Therefore, what is very important there is to look at what kind of alternative punishments other than imprisonment can be implemented. This is based on the UN guidelines, which are called the Tokyo Rules, looking at, for example, providing alternatives to imprisonment such as community service instead. And so this is something which would need to be changed within the Japanese Criminal Procedures Act. This is something which debate within the Diet would be needed in order to amend this legislation.
その刑務所内の状況に関してももちろん同時進行で改革する必要があってですね。で、実際にその2019年5月の国会議論の中で、2019年の時点で、3つの女性刑務所と2つの、確か医療刑務所、合計5つの刑事施設でその子どもを養育できる施設があるっていうような答弁が出ています。なのでその施設はあるんですよね。ただ多分そのリソースっていう、足りていないっていう現実もありますし、あるいはその先ほど高戸先生がおっしゃったそもそも告知義務がないから知らされていない、なので要請すらできないから刑事、所長も許可とか拒否とかする状況がそもそもないっていう、そこが問題かなと思います。でもやっぱり最終的にはそもそも刑務所に入れるべきじゃないっていうところをやっぱり強調したいです。そこに一回入ってしまうともう職も失うし住む場所も失うこともありますし、コミュニティ自分の地域にまた入ろうとしても拒絶される社会っていうのが待っていると思うので、そこを根っこから根本的に解決する必要があるかなと思います。
And at the same time as the legislative aspect, at the same time there needs to be in parallel also improvements or changes made within the prisons themselves. If we look at the debate which was held at the Diet in May of 2019, it recognized that there are 5 penal facilities, 3 women's prisons and 2 medical related or prisons in which there are facilities for women to be there with their infants as well. So the fact that this was recognized there. However, despite the fact that the facilities exist, the resources remain inadequate, including human resources as well. And as well as this, there is the issue also of the need to further inform women prisoners of the fact that they have the right to make this request to be together with their children as well. If they are not aware that this is even an option, then of course they cannot make that application and they cannot receive the permission for this. And so there needs to be these kinds of changes made within the prison system themselves as well. However, in the end, what I would really like to emphasize is that these women in these kinds of cases, we need to question whether they should be indeed sent to prison in the first place as well. Once they are in prison, then they are becoming within this system. They lose also their jobs, their homes on the outside, and then also when they are returning to society, in many cases they can be refused or have face many difficulties in that regard.
Koto-sensei, can you answer the second question about is there a history behind this? Just very shortly, and then we go to the last question.
そうですね。男性に比べて特別女性が悪い処遇を受けているというわけではないので、男性の状況もひどいので、歴史的に女性がというわけではなく、そもそも刑務所というものの処遇が日本において非常に劣悪であるというところかと思います。というのも、背景としてそもそも刑務所がどういうところなのかという発想が日本とまた、比較的進んでいるヨーロッパ等とはだいぶ違っています。ある方がおっしゃってたことなんですけれども、日本の刑務所は、足し算でヨーロッパの刑務所は引き算の考え方であるというふうに言っておりまして、人間っていうのは人権をフルパッケージで持っているものなんですね。ありとあらゆる自由があると。で、日本の刑務所に入るとその全てが奪われて、でそこからあなたにはこれを許可します、これを許可しますと言って後から足されていく。面会に関しても、真面目に過ごしていれば面会の回数が月に1回から2回になり3回になると増えていく。子どもに関しても、許可があれば育てられる。ただ逆にヨーロッパ等の先進国での考え方はフルパッケージの人権を持っていることが大前提なので、刑務所に入るからには移動の自由、職業の自由は制限します。ただそれ以外の子どもに会う、逆に子どもを産み育てるというのは女性にとっては 年齢的にも限られたものではありますので、たまたまその年齢で刑務所に入ったからといって、じゃあ子供を持つ権利すら奪われてしまうのかというと、日本人からすると先ほどちょっとご紹介した、パートナーと関係を持てる面会室があるというのは驚きだと思うんですけれども、でもよく考えてみれば、ちょうど20代、30代に刑務所に入っています。そうするとこの人はもう一生子供を持てないということになってしまうのですかというと、国がそこまで制限できるのかというのは非常に問題だと思います。
So, and as to whether there is a particular historical background for the violations against women, it is not necessarily that the violations against women are any worse than human rights violations against men in prisons. Rather, for all people within prisons in Japan, the situation is bad in that regards. However, there are particular difficulties when it comes, or differences in regards to how that comes out. I think related to this, there is also the historical background of the general thinking within society in Japan of what prisons are and what they are there for as well. And this is perhaps very different to the situation in some more progressive societies, such as some of those in Europe. One thing that someone said is that Japanese prisons, it is like adding something on, whereas for European prisons, they are removing or subtracting things. The meaning of this, if we look at human beings as being one single full package, in Japan, when humans are taken into prison, everything is taken away from them, and then one by one, they are allowed things on top of that. So they are, for example, having no visitations at first, then they're allowed 1 a month, 2 a month, 3 a month, and that increases from there. The same thing for being allowed access to their children as well. However, in the case of certain countries in Europe, when they are brought into prison, they are recognized as being a full package human being, and then certain rights are limited from there. For example, the rights for mobility or for employment, for example. However, the rights for access to their children are maintained. Particularly if we look at the case of women prisoners, of course, women whose childbearing years are limited physically as well. The fact that if they are not having rights to have children, for example, during the years where they are in prison, if this is during childbearing years, this has a particular implication for that women. Many people in Japan are perhaps surprised by the fact of hearing that some prisons in Europe, the visitation rooms even have beds where people can have relations with their partners. However, if we consider for women who may be imprisoned in their 20s and 30s, if they are not having that kind of access, that could mean that the state is in fact taking away their lifetime right to be able to have a child, for example.
Maybe one last question, please. We promised the reporter.
ありがとうございました。オンラインメディアの探査の辻と申します。2点ご質問します。1点目がその刑務所への医療アクセスが限られているというお話だったと思うんですが、逆にその抗精神薬とかいったものを鎮静の目的で受刑者の方が興奮状態にある時などの鎮静の目的で使われているような場合というのがあるんでしょうか。でもう1点目がですね、受刑者のお子さんっていうのが児童養護施設、親族に預けられない場合に児童養護施設とか乳児院とかに行かれると思うんですけれども、その出た後ですねに親とつなぐ役割を果たすのは現状児童相談所しかないのかといったそこのサポートがまた特別にあるのかというところをお聞きしたいです。
I'm from Tansa, an online media. I have 2 questions. First, there was a reference to access to medical care. I'd like to, there was also the mention of the inadequate medicines and so on available. I'd like to ask about the use of sedatives, for example, on prisoners within Japan. For example, if someone is in a state of excitement about the drugs which are used in those kind of cases. And the second point in regard to the children of prisoners, if they do not have any family who are able to take those children in, then they are sent to government facilities. But for later on, in regards to reconnecting them once again with their parents after their release, there is only the child consultation facilities which are able to really serve that kind of role. But if there is any particular kind of support or what the situation for that is.
ありがとうございます。1つ目の質問に関しては、そういった具体的な事例をちょっと把握はしていないんですけど、そのインタビューした元受刑者の中で、刑務所内で処方された薬の、なんだろう、その容量とかっていうのを教えてもらえなかったりとか、それを摂取したことによっていわゆる工場、その作業場での作業ができないぐらい頭が回らなかったりとか立てなくなったっていう証言はあります。で、
In regards to the first question, I don't necessarily have any very concrete examples, but within interviews with the women as part of this report, women talked about being prescribed drugs in particular times, but not being told or not having access to information about the volume of the drugs which they were prescribed, for example, but being unable to work, or even in cases unable to think or to even stand up because of the drugs that they were given. These are the kind of testimonies that we have heard within interviews.
薬とは関係ないんですけど、鎮静化っていう目的で例えば閉虚罰とか独居拘禁っていうのはいっぱいあって、そういった証言を多く入手していて、でその独居拘禁を例えば今回インタビューした方は28日間独居拘禁に入れられていた。で一般的にその2週大体14日間以上の独居拘禁っていうのが、過剰っていうふうに見なされています。なぜかというと、それ人間は社交的な生物だって、それをすごい狭い部屋に閉じ込めておくと、精神的な病気になるっていうこともあります。で実際にその方はその28日間の独居拘禁を終えた後に、うつ病っていうふうに診断されて、でそこでまた薬を処方されて、ただその処方された薬の内容何なのかわからない、でも摂取しないといけない、ただ摂取したらまた頭がぼーっとして工場での作業ができないっていう、この一連の負の連鎖っていうのはあります。
And while it's not in regards to drugs or medication as ways which are used to so-called sedate prisoners in cases of being censured and so on, solitary confinement is used in many cases. And there are many testimonies within the different interviews we had, including with one woman who was put in solitary confinement for 28 days. It's generally thought that 14 days is the limit for that human beings should be in these kind of circumstances, and anything over 14 days is excessive, being the fact that humans are social beings, social animals, and so being confined to such small quarters for a long period of time can lead to different psychological effects. And indeed, that individual, after having been kept in solitary confinement for 28 days, was diagnosed with depression, then had to be medicated again after that, was also not aware of the contents of the drugs which she was being prescribed, but needed or was forced to continue taking them, which then in turn became her, again, unable to be able to work. Her sort of mind was not operating properly, and so on. And so this vicious cycle which is entered into as sort of our relation to that.
で2つ目について簡単に高藤からご説明します。私がこれまで関わってきた受刑者や、受刑を終えて出所された方に関しては、いずれも児相の方がお子さんとあと親御さんとの間をつないでおりました。子どもがどこにいるかお伝えできないようなケースでは手紙の仲介ですとか、小さなお子さんの場合は、お写真など成長の度合いの報告といった仲介になりますし、子どもと面会はできるんだけれども一緒に住むまでは関係構築に至ってないようなケースでは面会のサポートなどを、児相がしてくれています。他の組織っていうのはちょっと聞いたことはないです。
And so as to women prisoners or those who have been released as well, who I have worked with or have encountered as well, in these cases they are connected to their children by the child consultation, the government agency which is responsible for that. And for this purpose, if they are able to live together, that is one option. If they're not able to meet directly, they facilitate the communication through letters, for example, or in cases where the children are still very small, also providing photographs or reports showing the child's growth and so on. So this agency then provides the role of mediating between, or communicating, facilitating this between the parents and the children. In the case where the relationship is not rebuilt enough for them to be able to live together, they also facilitate meetings, for example, or visitations within, between the family as well.
Thank you very much. It's been a great honor to have you here, and a very grim discussion I can see, and it's going to continue. And let's hope the Ministry of Justice makes the changes, and they're not just addressing the inmates politely, those kinds of changes, but more profound changes. Teppei, Kasai, Ayuko, Takatoh, Goro, Koto, and Marie Joyce, please, thank you very much.